You wouldn't think a shopping list hammered into copper could keep grown adults awake at night, but this one tries. A rolled sheet, greened by time and stubborn as a kettle bottom, was found in a Judean cave and began doing what lists do best. It quietly reminded people of things. Not bread and onions, but jars and bars, measures and locations. All described with a voice that sounds like a clerk who has seen everything and is determined to use as few adjectives as possible. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to hear more lists read very slowly, or don't, I'll never know. A copper scroll is not meant for dramatic music or heroic chases. It is meant for a table, a lamp, and someone who reads aloud with the stamina of a sand dune. The letters are not ink. They are strokes pressed into metal, each one as shallow as a breath on a cold window. Copper is not cozy to write on. You can hear it in your head. The faint tack of a stylus, the complaint of the sheet as it's unrolled, the tiny click when a line ends and the next begins. It is all very industrious and not at all cinematic. This scroll does not beg to be unrolled in one sweep like a red carpet. It prefers to be handled in polite strips, like dried fruit, which is more practical than romantic. It seems to say, if you must read me, do it gently. Evening settles in a cave called Cave 3, which sounds like the third attempt at naming rather than a landmark. A low light trembles on the stone, and the roll sits there with the patient confidence of an object that has seen far worse storage conditions. Someone once hammered it thin, wrote on it, and rolled it up again like a pastry that refused to be eaten. The Hebrew is formal but brisk, as if the scribe had been paid per location, not per flourish. There are no prayers on this list, only places, weights, and the occasional helpful hint, such as by the cistern or under the steps, the kind of advice you get from an uncle who hides spare keys optimistically. When you hold metal writing, you feel the text, literally. The letters rise, and your fingers read too. Ink can run and parchment can smolder. Copper just oxidizes and keeps sulking. The scroll's maker trusted the metal more than memory. It is not there to persuade, only to survive. If you imagine the scribe's day, it is not a dramatic one. There is a bench that rocks slightly, a sheet that may or may not lie flat, and a stylus that tries to behave. Lines are ruled as if by a very tidy horizon. The letters are neat but not fussy. They remind you of the handwriting of a person who keeps trying to leave the office early and never quite does. Some lines pause to specify capacity talents, mine is. The antique relatives of kilograms, and you can sense a tiny sigh of relief because numbers do not argue. The script repeats itself happily. Gold here, silver there, vessels somewhere else. The cadence becomes sleepy. Near the cairn, below the stair, in the canal, beside the rock. If a lullaby were a municipal inventory, this would be it. The copper catches the lamp and throws back a dull glow like a loaf just underbaked. The cave air is slow, and you start thinking about how many lists your own life contains, and how few of them are hammered into durable goods. Why copper at all? It helps to imagine the near future mood at the time of writing. Parchments were perfectly fine until one day they might not be, and a metal sheet is what you choose when you expect rain, fire, or a regrettably energetic search party. Copper is the please do not lose this of antiquity. The style is not poetic because poetry would be wasteful. The scribe is saving adjectives the way you save twine. Each location is a pen, and the scroll is the corkboard. It would rather be hard to read than easy to erase. When the sheet buckles, the words ripple like a sleepy pond. They stay legible. Copper ages the way certain cheeses do. It becomes more itself. The writer is giving future hands a favor and a nuisance in equal portions. The directions do not begin with a map. They begin with a habit. At the fork, by the cistern, under the steps near the salty water, which is almost helpful and somehow not quite. Wadis change course in the slightest rain. A terrace collapses with the patience of a tired bookshelf. Someone adds a wall. Someone removes a stair, stone by stone, like a slow magic trick. Names perpetuate themselves even when the objects move away. You are told to look where the valley bends like an elbow, but you were not given the same elbow. A phrase like north of the aqueduct speaks confidently and points at a structure that has not checked in for 2,000 years. The directions do not fail, they just refuse to settle. They are the GPS that keeps rerouting because it remembers roads that the earth has politely buried. Each item has the crisp rhythm of a receipt. So many talents of gold, so many of silver, so many vessels, a bar or two just to keep things interesting. The platter count alone can put you to sleep, which for us is a feature. The precision is soothing. If a line says 40 talents, it means 40, not a dramatic 40. You can almost see the scale, the tiny weights like checkers, the beam easing itself to level. Once in a while, a location sounds modest under a threshold here, near a cairn there, and you are reminded that treasure does not care if the view is good. The scroll is quietly confident that everyone involved knows which threshold and which cairn, because they lived here and we do not, and because you only explain what you think the other person might forget. Caves remember things people do not, but unfortunately refuse to speak up. You ask who hid it and get a set of soft answers. Some imagine temple staff moving wealth in a hurry, a kind of sacred logistic sprint, but with better handwriting. Others imagine multiple caches, community deposits, monastery piggy banks, or private stashes wearing public labels. A coalition of caution, you could say. Each theory arrives on sensible feet, looks around, and sits very politely next to the others. None of them tries to win. The scroll itself is uninterested in motive. It does not say why, only where, which is the sort of conversation you have with a list when you're late and the list has no sympathy. It supplies the calm of an address book. The amounts are large enough to tempt, but the tone never raises its voice. If you expect a final flourish, and lo, the great hoard lies beneath, you will be gently disappointed. It says, essentially, see previous instructions. People have looked, of course. Teams have walked the wadis with rods and tape measures, which is a sentence that already makes sleep comfortable. They bring maps with squares and gently penciled arrows. The desert accepts their company and gives them a breeze. The wadis answer with shapes that look like old stories, a collapsed terrace that might be a cavity, a line of stones that might be an old path, a patch of shade that refuses to be necessary. Spades go in, spades come out, and the ground confides nothing, the way an old friend smiles and changes the subject. The scroll does not laugh at them, it just continues to be itself. When a dick pauses for tea, the list waits under a cloth like a sandwich that no one is quite ready to eat. There's a pleasant rumor economy around the copper scroll. One says that a key list must be missing a second document with nicknames, cross-references, and insider jokes, the helpful kind that tells you which stone of 3 corners was meant given the local tradition of having many stones and many corners. Another rumor proposes that the scroll is a decoy, and that the real value lies not in the buried bars, but in the discipline of burying and making. Important things ordinary and placing them among steps and drains where no one expects ceremony. Either way, the security model is not drama, but choreography. Nothing relies on a single lock. Everything relies on many people doing unremarkable things in the same way for a long time. A lock can be picked, a habit is hard to steal. If there was a network, its strongest feature was the collective decision to remain boring. That is extremely powerful and remarkably restful. The numerals do have a kind of sleepy charm. Talents and minas are cousins of the kilogram, but slower and more sociable. They ask for scales with actual arms. They insist on balance, not just display. When the scroll mentions a measure, it trusts a world that checked weight with little metal discs, some stamped as if proud, some smoothed by thumbs. You imagine the beam swaying once, twice, resting like a cat. You picture someone nodding and the piece of metal learning its place among other pieces. The temptation is to convert all the totals into modern metrics, but that makes the text unhappy. Better to leave the numbers in their original shoes and let them shuffle. Scholars brought the late modern toolkit to bear on this quiet artifact. Raking light reveals hesitations and corrections, places where the scribe leaned a little more, then less, as if thinking through copper. RTI reflectance transformation imaging, a phrase that sounds flashy but mostly involves patience, lets the letters shrug off shadows. The alloy composition is checked because copper tells you where it came from the way dialect tells you where a person grew up. The measurements of the strips are written down by people who also write down the weight of their own pencils, just to be safe. You can feel the lab coat as sleeves, gently brushing the bench as someone turns the sheet and sighs contentedly. The verdict is neither surprise nor scandal. The text is authentic. The hordes, if they existed, remain unproven. This is the kind of conclusion that helps people sleep very well. The scroll's voice is bureaucratic in the best way. It offers no plot, only procedure. To read it is to walk along lines, to tip from location to location like a person testing tiles for loose ones. It rewards slowness and punishes enthusiasm. The best readers are those who think in inventory, who enjoy the moment when a number sits squarely in a ledger and refuses to wiggle. Sometimes the directions clip along so tidily that you smile. Under the steps of the salt water? Yes, of course. Which steps? Which salt? You are being treated as a local, which is flattering and unhelpful. You can almost hear the scribe thinking, if you don't know the steps, perhaps you are not invited. If the caches existed, someone may have followed these lines at night, carrying a lamp that decided not to flicker, stepping slowly to count paces the way you count sheep. They would have spoken quietly if at all, because the best thing to say to a threshold that hides gold is nothing. The list reads as if it never expected to meet us. It hoped to meet someone else much sooner. Yet here we are, 2,000 years and several translation choices later, obediently pronouncing each place name as if the stones might be listening. This is, in its way, a comfort. The scroll shows a world where everything precious had a place, however provisional, and where even treasure behaved like diligent furniture. There is a peace in that idea. The wealth is less interesting than the order. Now and then a specific line pulls at the imagination with the softness of a sleeve. You read in the canal, and you picture a watercourse, dry half the year, with silt fine as flour. You imagine a jar placed when the mud was still polite, and the same jar later, deeper, having a conversation with clay. Or you read beneath the threshold, and you see a slab smoothing over the entrance to a storeroom, the gentle thud of sandals stepping across wealth that is acting modest. The best hiding places are the ones that refuse to feel special. Treasure that behaves like a doorstop rarely needs guards. Collectors of theories have their favorite shelves. One theory prefers the scroll as an archive of temple accounts relocated for safety, a way to ensure that, should rebuilding be required, the memory of what was owed could be taken out of storage as neatly as the vessels themselves. Another prefers a more distributed model, communities compiling their savings into a travel-size inventory in case the political weather turned unhelpful. Yet another suggests that the real point was to make people show up and look, because looking keeps communities tidy. If you spend an afternoon checking cisterns for hidden jars, you might also clear out a drain, and the town will thank you. None of these theories collide. They nod to one another like neighbors borrowing salt. The practical question, did anyone ever find any of it, meets the practical answer. Not convincingly, not in a way that lets the list exhale and take a bow. A few objects have surfaced over the decades, the way lone socks appear in hallways, but the grand correlation between line and jar remains politely pending. The desert is a good collaborator for secrets. Shovel blade and stone have many conversations that produce nothing quotable. You get the sense that if the scroll ever did direct someone to an exact place, the place would have thanked the visitor and then rearranged itself a little, just to be sure it would not have to do it again. Meanwhile, the artifact simply persists. Conservators keep it from further sulking into green. Translators render it into modern languages with the exactness of a person packing cutlery. The margins of editions gather pencil notes in gentle handwriting. We measure the strips again, not because they have changed, but because measuring is a kind of respect. Copper feels these attentions like a cat tolerating a comb. It endures. It does not purr. Every few years, someone proposes a clever new angle of approach, a satellite map, a LiDAR scan, a statistical analysis of the distribution of under the steps, and the scroll continues to enjoy being a list. Its greatest talent is remaining interesting without ever becoming exciting. If you are still awake, you can notice small, friendly absurdities. For instance, that a text about enormous amounts of wealth manages to be the least braggy thing in its entire region, or that the only jokes it tells are practical. Near the cairn, very funny. Which cairn? You remember your own house keys and how you assure yourself that you put them in the usual place, and then must define usual like a philosopher. The copper scroll is universal in that sense. It gives directions the way humans do, perfectly, and only if you were already there. The last comfort it offers is domestic. Whether the caches were ever retrieved is not the only point. The act of listing was a ritual of control. Someone faced worry with a schedule. Someone turned fear into measurements that could be read by lamplight. That is a kindness across centuries. The scroll asks you to imagine a cupboard for every valuable, a place for each cup and bar, a map that says, in effect, we know where things are. It is a bedtime idea. Even if morning brings a different landscape, the list keeps the promise for the length of a night. So we step back from Cave 3. The air grows cooler. The copper keeps its gentle, unhelpful shine. Outside, the wadis pretend to be asleep. A breeze quietly edits the sand. The numbers on the page stop trying to be useful and relax into being numbers again. Somewhere, a modern scale settles level on a lab bench and is pleased with itself. And the scroll, heavy as a promise and light as a habit, remains rolled and resting, a map that refuses to be a map, a treasure list that is most comfortable as literature for accountants. We leave it there, intact, unhurried, letting the words about cisterns and steps and stones lie back down where they have been lying for a very long time. If anyone asks, we were here, we read the list, and we put the light out with both hands, very carefully, so the metal could do what it does best, which is to sit and wait without blinking. You might not expect a nation to negotiate its identity through rectangles of baked mud, but the Netherlands rather politely did. Not loudly, not with marble, but with bricks the size of a hand, sometimes a bit smaller because the clay preferred to shrink at its own pace. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe so I can whisper about more rectangles later. Or don't, I'll just keep counting them, which is soothing either way. Dutch bricks, soft when new and stubborn when old, have the calm confidence of objects that have outlived their makers and their makers' reasons. They were formed in molds dusted with sand, patted level with a wooden strike, turned out like loaves, stacked like books, fired until they sang when tapped clink, hence clinker, and then persuaded to raft through canals as if they were an unusually punctual species of fish. Whole towns were arranged around their moods. If the brick said it needed another week to dry, everyone made tea and agreed. Clay does not hurry, and Dutch clay least of all. It arrives each spring as the river becomes temporarily generous with its banks, laying down fine silt as if spreading a blanket for later. Brickmakers, who had the practical optimism of gardeners, scooped it up in heaps that moved only when pushed, mixed in a little timber, old shard, ground brick, or just stubborn sand, and then waited through a short conversational silence while the mixture remembered it wanted to be something. The molds were wooden and simple, like drawers for a desk that never got built. A young worker dusted them with sand so the clay would let go later, the way a cake tin asks for flour. Another worker, often called the tickler, pressed the clay in with a thumb at each corner and a pat that sounded like careful applause. The strike and actual stick called the strike skimmed the excess. If a few thin curls fell onto the table, nobody minded. They would be rolled into the next handful. The raw bricks took the sun like lizards, laid out in fields that looked, from a distance, like someone had planted rectangles. If a gull landed on them, it left a very minor historical document. The seasons were mixed into the bricks from the beginning. Rain left freckles, wind left opinions, and a day with too much cloud left everything thoughtful. They were favorite sizes because every country has opinions about rectangles. In the 17th century, a standard Dutch brick might be something like 17 by 8 by 4 centimeters, give or take the whims of shrinkage and the brickmaker's lunch. They were small compared to later bricks elsewhere, which was convenient for hands, walls, and the rhythm of a person who had to carry a lot of them without becoming historical themselves. Small bricks also did well in ships where they nested neatly, letting the boat believe it was carrying something more interesting than clay. If you tap a good clinker, even when it is closed into a wall and minding its business, you can hear a slight glassy note. It is the sound of sand turning briefly into music. The drying sheds were half buildings, more suggestion than structure. A roof kept the rain from changing jobs with the bricks. Sides were optional because wind is better than walls when you are trying to persuade water to leave politely. Stacks were turned and turned again in case the back row felt neglected. There is a technique to carrying 2 raw bricks in one hand palm flat, thumbs forward, the rectangles like well-behaved pets. Apprentices learned it quickly because a dropped brick is an opinion that weighs exactly as much as a fine. Even the footprints in the drying yard mattered. A neat path made by careful feet meant a day had gone well. If you want to imagine the sound, it's the soft slap of clay on wood, the small hiss of sand, the friendly thud of bricks being stacked in a way that says, later. Firing, when it finally happened, was not a drama so much as a long conversation with heat. Clamp kilns were made from the bricks themselves, a careful pile with channels for the fire to wander through like a visitor who keeps getting distracted. The fuel was whatever the landscape offered without complaint peat in great crumbly slabs. Brushwood, sometimes coal when it felt modern enough to show up. The stack was higher than a person, with deliberate holes and an outer coat of bricks that had already learned not to be surprised by anything. Once lit, the fire made its slow diplomatic rounds. The workers listened with their faces. A good burn had a smell like very clean toast, which sounds wrong until you stand there and nod. The outer bricks became darker, harder, even a bit glossy where the heat had been ambitious. These were the clinkers that would end up paving quays and stoops, making a precise, satisfying sound under shoes. Bricks from the comfortable middle of the stack stayed a mild orange or red and would spend their future holding roofs in an unassuming way. In the morning, when everything still panted with warmth, and you could write your name on the air, the pile looked exactly the same, except that it had turned into a town. Sorting is the quiet triumph of the trade. Each brick is weighed by the hand and the eye. A slight warp can be coaxed into alignment by where it is placed in the wall. A shy crack is matched with a friendly neighbor. The worst are not wasted. They become cores of piers or underlays for floors where no one will interrupt them. The best get stacked by 12s and 20s in bundles with their own manners, then counted in bigger numbers that sound like nicknames. Traders talked in thousands, often by the 100 dozens, and nobody worried about the arithmetic because the stacks themselves kept score. A foreman could glance across a yard and think calmly of 3 houses and a bridge. It is a rare pleasure to feel architecture as inventory. When a yard had enough piles to feel ambitious, the barges appeared. A brick barge sits low and broad, the extrovert cousin of a dining table, and is happiest when carrying more than seems wise. Stevedores used brick tongs, scissor-like carriers that pinch a pair of bricks, though the truly confident simply used their hands and the trolley-like rhythm learned after the first 1,000. Each barge acquired a temporary smell: wet rope, warm clay, a hint of peat smoke that had remembered to linger. With a full load, it moved out into the canal like a cow pretending to be aristocratic, unhurried but certain. Canals were not just roads. They were arguments solved in advance. Wind could be persuaded by a small sail. In dead calm, a tow horse on the bank picked up the slack like an understanding friend. If the barge brushed a key, the bricks answered with that neat clink, as if counting themselves present. At warehouses, the stacks were lifted again and counted again, because counting is how you make numbers relax. The tally sticks and the chalk marks on door frames were private languages that everyone spoke without noticing. Some bricks arrived stamped with a maker's initials or a simple symbol, nothing pretentious, just enough to remember by. A stamped frog on the brick, space frog being the polite word for the shallow depression, could make a builder mysteriously happy after a long day. Records from the more diligent towns are full of lines like, "Received today 12,000 plain, 3,000 hard clinkers, 500 odd," and then a note about rain and the price of peat. If that puts you to sleep, congratulations, you have achieved the correct listening posture. The bricks traveled further than their language. As ballast, they went along for the ride to the Baltic and home again, keeping ships honest in rough seas and then stepping ashore to make keys in far harbors. To New Amsterdam they sailed, to York and Boston and the Caribbean. A Dutch brick, small and slightly smug, might become the arch over a colonial bakery and spend the next 3 centuries sniffing cinnamon. In England, where there was a brick tax in the 18th century that made larger bricks briefly fashionable, Dutch sizes looked almost dainty and therefore somehow correct. On Danish islands, the clinker became a paving stone that knew the names of rain clouds. Bricks like to travel, but they also like to stop, and their favorite stopping place is wherever feet need something reliable. Builders treated the palette like a puzzle box. The basic wall pattern stretcher, header, has the tidy regularity of a knitting stitch. In the Dutch bond, where headers march in consistent lines, a facade becomes a graph of trust. Window arches were low and polite, just high enough to let in sky and gossip. Corners were lessons in patience. Bricks trimmed with a trowel's back, the face smoothed with a rubbing stone, everything lining up so a passerby's eyes could rest without complaint. Mortar was lime-based and pale, as mild as porridge. If the joint needed to shed water, it was ironed into a subtle ridge that only rain fully appreciated. Sometimes a black vitrified brick, the kind that had sat too close to heat and come away with a shiny opinion, was tucked into a pattern like punctuation. Whole towns learned to speak in these small emphases. Repairs were a conversation across decades. A cracked step was not an emergency, only an invitation. Someone heated a small pot of sand and tar for a quick patch on a key. Someone else picked out a loose brick and turned it, because the other face still had patience left. Replacement bricks were chosen with the tact you use for family gatherings. A slightly off color would be placed where shadow lived already. If a whole section had to be rebuilt, the old bricks were cleaned of their lime with a tap and a shrug, and went back into service, because the best compliments to a town are the ones it gives itself. In winter, the paving bricks skated under iron blades and survived, because frozen water respects things that are already hard. The bookkeeping around all of this is its own deep pillow. Accounts from city almshouses list deliveries by the thousand with small clarifying notes. For the gable, to mend after the wind, for paving, the schoolyard muddy, for the bakehouse, where flour prefers dignity. You can see the buildings appear in the columns. The stroke of a clerk's quill becomes a foundation. If a barge is delayed by ice, the entry merely says so, and you understand a frozen canal better than any engraving could show it. The pairs of numbers match like socks. When they do not, a tiny remark explains the stray dozen. Fall, or broken, or gift. The word gift in a brick ledger is the most restful word of all. Brick prices shifted with the weather and the fuel. A dry summer meant more finished stacks and a lower price in autumn. A wet spring meant motionless yards and polite shortages that forced builders into conversation with patience. Taxes wandered in and out of the story like slow-moving guests. A bridge project would pause while a committee discussed the correct blend of clinker for the roadway hard enough not to be surprised by cartwheels, but not so glassy that a horse would hold a grudge. Decisions always ended with tea. The tea is not recorded, but tea is always there. The human part of the industry remains modestly visible. There is the brick turner with sand on both hands, who sings without noticing. There is the kill watcher who can tell by the orange at midnight whether the flu wants attention. There's the barge hand who checks the ropes the way other people check pockets. There's the apprentice who has a favorite mold because the left edge is friendlier. Their names are ordinary and happily so. If any of them had a dramatic anecdote, the brick absorbed it and kept the secret. Cities grew out of these routines like lichen, slow, persistent, and satisfied. Step stoops with iron railings, canal houses with reflected faces, warehouses with hoisting beams that pretended to be noses. All of them are assemblies of rectangular decisions. The famous Dutch gable is a theater for bricks. Each curve asks a straight-edged thing to pretend it is flexible, and it agrees one course at a time. In the countryside, farmhouses were brick, like a cardigan over a timber frame, warm and dependable. In the polder, where the land below sea level keeps a private diary about water, dike houses used bricks as if they were not worried about anything, which is the kindest kind of faith. Sometimes a wall remembers the hands that made it so clearly that you can put your own fingers into the old handling marks and feel instructed. Other times it remembers only weather, the prevailing wind in the Patna, the winter sun and the moss that chose the north side for reasons moss refuses to share. A brick knows the difference between rain that travels far and rain that begins at home. It knows the precise sound of a bicycle tire on morning paving. It knows how a key dropped from a pocket rings against a step, and how the same key sounds different on foggy nights. Not all bricks behaved. A misfired batch might go soft after a decade like bread that forgot it was toast. Then a street would be lifted with an embarrassed chuckle and reset with bricks of better character. Wagon ruts and keys were not an embarrassment, but a biography. The solution was to move a few clinkers from right to left, as you do with thoughts. The problem became a pattern, and the pattern became interesting to feed. Nothing, if you do it long enough, stays a problem. It becomes an arrangement. There were jokes, gently practical jokes, like the one about the Sunday brick that never gets laid because it is always being admired. There were sayings, 2 hands, 2 bricks, meaning both that you should carry what you can and that you should not reinvent plenty. Some yards had a brick shaped like a wedge used to prop open the lunch shed door. If it went missing, the entire afternoon developed an unnecessary personality. One foreman kept a brick on his desk as a paperweight and called it the accountant because it kept everyone honest simply by sitting there. If you travel by canal long enough, you meet the brick markets without needing to know their names. The keys are neat, the cranes uncomplicated, the voices carrying measurements more clearly than opinions. Barges with empty bellies and hopeful ropes wait in a queue made entirely of patience. A dog sleeps because everything is already planned. In winter, ice makes a polite suggestion to the schedule. and schedules bow as if they had expected to be consulted. In spring, the clay returns to the banks the way a friend returns a book and apologizes for having kept it too long. What makes this whole arrangement pleasantly soporific is the refusal of any single part to be a climax. The kilt does not explode, it simmers. The bark does not race. It leans. The ledger does not shout. It totals. Bricks, behaving like guests who have been told their rooms are ready, simply go where they are meant to. Even the color palette is the palette of bedtime. Warm reds, mild oranges, cured browns, the occasional dark gleam tucked in for interest like a comma. The soundscape is the best part. The wooden clack of molds, the sandy sigh of a lifted brick, the distant muffle of a horse, a notably crisp clink as a clinker says good morning to a key. In the evening, when the yard has put its tools away and the last barge noses into its berth, the stacks look like paragraphs. The sky turns to the same color as a well-fired brick, and you can no longer tell where architecture stops and weather starts. Someone locks a shed door with a key on a ribbon. Someone notes by lamplight, sent today 6,000 clinkers, 18,000 common. Someone folds the page and thinks about soup. And the bricks, being exactly what they are and nothing else, continue to hold up the world the way a good sentence holds up a thought, quietly, without wincing, certain that morning will ask them to do it again. If you have drifted a little, that is appropriate. Bricks do not mind being background. They prefer it. They like to be the silence behind conversation, the floor under footsteps, the edge under a cup of coffee left briefly on a stoop. Their most ambitious dream is to be swept. Tomorrow will bring more hand-sized promises from the molds, more stacks bedded in wind, more stacks afloat, more walls adding themselves politely to other walls. The Netherlands will continue to describe itself in rectangles and commas, and the canals will continue to read. And when you sleep, it is entirely possible that your breath will find the same rhythm as a barge loaded to the gunnels moving so slowly. You can barely see it move a few clinkers sounding softly at the key as if counting people home. You might not expect a treasure map to sound like a baking tray when you tap it, but this one does. The copper scroll, which is less a scroll than a stubborn cylinder of bronze-colored metal with opinions, waits where the desert keeps its paperwork. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe for more documents with personality, or don't, and let the consonants of ancient Hebrew hum at the edge of your eyelids like a fan that refuses to be dramatic. The first thing everyone learns about this scroll is also the least helpful. It is real metal, not papyrus or skin, and it has the weight to prove it. When you picture a scroll, you probably imagine something that flutters if a door opens. This one would dent the door. It was found not in a chest or a temple, but in a cave whose number sounds like a bus route cave, 3 quiet as a pantry shelf, and about as glamorous. A team of people with the patient optimism of librarians removed it from its niche, noticed that it was not in a reading mood, and sent it away to be unrolled by someone with tools and non-judgmental hands. Copper does not like to be persuaded after it has hardened. It prefers an endless, polite argument conducted with chisels. The unrolling happened in slow slices, not a theatrical reveal. The metal had become, over the centuries, less flexible than a good idea in a bad meeting. Conservators cut the cylinder into long curved ribbons that remembered being a tube even when asked kindly to lie flat. Imagine a cinnamon roll asking to become a map and deciding to compromise by being neither. Under lamplight, the letters lifted from the surface with that shy gleam old bronze gets when it forgives oxygen for being everywhere. The script is Hebrew, but a workmanlike sort, more warehouse than synagogue abbreviations that think in inventory. Verbs that prefer to give directions rather than have feelings. Where other scrolls are prayers, this one is a grocery list written by someone who has already eaten. At the cistern, it says, or under the steps, or by the conduit at the valley's fork, and it supplies measures that keep nodding. talents, minas, cubits, the kind of numbers you can fall asleep counting. No poetry interrupts the arithmetic. It is soothing how little it tries to persuade. People ask why anyone would write on copper when they could have written on something friendlier. The short answer is permanence with an attitude. Parchment sulks in humidity. Papyrus breaks into coughs if handled after a dry century. Metal keeps secrets with the certitude of a lock. The scribe and the sponsor someone practical who believed that instructions are only as good as the surface that survives chose the durable option and accepted the weight. Their ink is not ink, but letters incised with a point, each cut a small, controlled decision. The scroll does not really bear writing. It is the writing, and the voice is efficient. It does not pause to say why treasure needed hiding, or whose it had been before the concept ours became later. It assumes people know what trouble means and how fast it travels in sand. One can imagine the scribe in a storage room that pretended to be an office, leaning over the sheet with the focus of a bookkeeper during inventory season and thinking about water skins. The desert around Qamran treats direction the way the sea treats paths. They exist until they dawn. Wadis are enthusiastic one day and theoretical the next. Terraces slide into their own shadows and forget that they used to be ledges. In this landscape, the scroll style makes sense. It uses nouns that sit still and avoids adjectives that wander. At the east, it says, and then ties the phrase to some man-made thing: a cistern, a stair, a reservoir that would stay put long enough to be useful. It names the Jordan as if he might attend the meeting. It speaks of caves as if caves were friends of the family. There are no distances for carriages or lists of landmarks that would be impressive on postcards. Instead, so many cubits this way, so many that, and an instruction to dig that reads less like adventure and more like a chore you do before lunch so the afternoon remains manageable. The entries themselves have a comforting repetitiveness. They start with a place that sounds both obvious and impossible, in the courtyard of the wash house, then a direction or depth, then a weight of metal that suggests generous accounting. A talent is heavy enough to make your arms believe in arithmetic. Minas are friendly fractions. The numbers are large but not loud. A reader with a pencil might be tempted to add columns and say, that can't be right, but the scroll is not interested in being right in the way you think. It is interested in being precise in a world that reliably rearranges itself. There is a mild amusement in discovering how often the phrase "at the third" or "at the entrance to the cave" recurs. Whoever wrote this had certain favorite categories of reality. If they had owned sticky notes, they would have been the pale yellow kind, lined, stacked at the edge of a desk with the corners carefully squared. As for who hid what, the scroll offers the tone of someone passing on a responsibility rather than confessing to a hobby. Later readers propose temple treasurers evacuating funds in nervous installments, or a coalition of caretakers distributing wealth like seeds before a sandstorm. It might have been a decoy, a bureaucratic placebo meant to redirect later excitement into hole digging at scenic locations. Or it might be exactly what it claims, written in manner all careful people use when they write instructions for their future selves, with the eerie belief that clarity alone can defeat forgetting. The Hebrew itself helps the theory of caretakers. It is biblical enough to be comfortable, but not so elegant that a scribe would have sat back to admire it. The grammar says, put it there, not let it be placed. Somewhere in the past, a person who disliked improvisation made a list they trusted more than memory. Excavations followed and then, with admirable predictability, did not follow much further. Teams went to the wadi beds with measuring rods and the kind of spades that work well when optimism is in season. They found steps in several places, just as steps tend to appear wherever people once wanted elevation to behave, and cisterns that had retired from their last job and become stories. The earth spoke in its usual dialect of possibilities. Any sand that could hide something could also pretend it had never seen people. Pits answered politely with more pits. It is a small skill to tell a hole that has held treasure from a hole that has held air. The difference is mostly patience. Observers alternated between assembling theories and disassembling them again for parts. Rumors circulated with the self-replenishing energy of gossip. Someone had found a sealed cavity and opened it to discover rocks. Someone else had an aunt whose neighbor's cousin had seen an inventory stamped on a shard that matched entry 27, except that it did not exist. The copper scroll watched all of this from behind glass with the expression of a ledger that has watched many budgets. Meanwhile, the scroll itself became a kind of experiment in reading metal, as if it were landscape. Conservators mapped every scratch and hesitation because even the way a letter slants can say whether a scribe wrote before or after lunch. Epigraphy, which is the science of taking handwriting personally, noted where the stylus bit a little too eagerly and where the copper resisted and won. Metallurgists asked the alloy how much tin it preferred and whether the sheet rolled out from a respectable workshop or a very patient shed. A laboratory test might clip a sliver no wider than a pencil line and ask it, by means of isotopes, whether it had grown up by this river or that. The answers were typically modest. Yes, ancient. Yes, copper with a little something extra to encourage hardness. No, not inclined to name names. The scroll had the personality of an elderly file cabinet, dignified, informative, unwilling to speculate. What scholars loved most quietly in footnotes were the small corrections. In one place, the scribe seems to have paused, reconsidered the count of minas, and trimmed a numeral into a better numeral with the corner of the tool. In another, a letter is struck again at a slightly different angle. The first one perhaps not sounded to the scribe's satisfaction. You can almost hear a soft If you slow down enough, the text turns into a sequence of tiny choices, each embedded in metal like footprints in dry mud. Evidence of tool marks lines up with ancient standards. The depth of the cut is consistent with a hand that had done this before. The spacing behaves. The lines are ruled with a string and a little chalk or charcoal the way carpenters still do. Nothing flamboyant appears. Even the punctuation is the punctuation of someone who would alphabetize spices. The directions, when plotted on a modern map, perform a mild magic trick. They both fit and refuse to fit. Several entries love the idea of the valley's fork, which is admirable imagery until you realize valleys fork quite often, especially when later rains have introduced new opinions to old topography. A cistern at the northern opening is less a place than a personality. The effect is hypnotic rather than frustrating. Each instruction asks the brain to hold a possible landscape still for a minute, and then set it down gently so the next one can be lifted. You could make an evening of tracing them with your finger on the page, traveling from hypothetical steps to hypothetical stone doors, counting cubits like sheep and being barely disappointed that no flock appears. The sums, when quietly added, make historians sit down carefully. If taken at face value, the list would represent a hoard that could fund either a serious renovation of the known world or an exceptionally ambitious bake sale. Opinions split the way cakes do into neat wedges. Some argue the numbers are conventional shorthand for a lot, used the way a child says a million, to mean more than you can imagine but less than the sky. Others propose that the treasure once existed in the same way autumn once existed, briefly, locally, and that it moved on. A few read the entries as a network rather than a pile, a way of saying, our resources are diversified across several wadis, please find comfort in that. The scroll, as always, declines to clarify. It has the serenity of a ticket inspector who knows the train will arrive whether or not anyone worries. What if it is a decoy? This favorite hypothesis, folded neatly and kept at the back of the intellectual cupboard, has an odd elegance. You imagine caretakers under pressure choosing copper because copper impresses, then inscribing plausible directions to impressive emptiness so that anything with hands would be busy in the wrong place. If so, it is a decoy that has carried on working long after it needed to. It has absorbed entire afternoons of speculation the way deserts absorb footsteps. On the other hand, what if it is the opposite of a decoy, a sincere attempt to hand the future a map that would make sense after a generation or two, when everyone had calmed down? In that case, the vagueness is a feature, not a bug. Only someone who already knew would be able to translate the third step into a particular stare. Passwords don't have to be clever when they are written in shared habits. The more you stare at copper letters, the more they begin to sound like quietly spoken advice. The instruction, dig down 9 cubits, is less a command than a rhythm. A cubit is a forearm in a bit. 9 forearms make a person look thoughtfully at the ground and decide to have lunch first. The repeated mention of jars, bronze, or stone implies sensible packaging. No one wants to carry loose coins through gravel. A sealed jar can survive an argument with time and occasionally win. The word for entrance occurs often enough that the whole composition starts to feel architectural. Even the idea of treasure needs a doorway. When the text mentions a marker stone, you picture something shoulder high and shyly particular. Where is it now? Probably having a good time pretending to be any other stone. Modern tools have offered themselves as interpreters, and the scroll has thanked them by remaining itself. Ground-penetrating radar has swept fields that were enjoying their quiet. Drones have looked down at terraces that kept their contours like folded linen. Computer models have laid the entries onto one plausible map after another to see which illusion is the politest. Each method nods to the next and says, "You try," in the collegial way of bedtime puzzles. Occasionally, a cave opens in a new place, and everyone smiles and writes down what it smells like, which is usually dust, with notes of goat and history. The tests say the copper's patina formed over a long time, that the letters are not a modern prank, that the cuts are old and confident. The verdict is the restful kind, authentic object, ambiguous purpose. If you press your ear to the glass, don't but imagine, you might believe you can hear the original room where the scribe worked. A place with a table that wobbled slightly, a pot of oil for the lamp, a jar of water that reflected an eyelash when someone leaned over to check a numeral. You might hear the way a point scratches metal, a noise like frost writing itself on a window. You might hear breath taken before the phrase, and in the cistern. It is a pleasant fiction. The real sound in the museum is the air system doing its faithful rounds. Still, the curve of each ribbon remembers human temperature, and that seems enough to make the past feel present without asking it to perform. What the copper scroll gives best is a sense of order pressed into material as resistant as the conditions it imagined. It is a list that believes in lists even when the landscape has taken up improvisation. Every entry ends with the quiet confidence of a period. No exclamation marks appear because no one, then or now, needs punctuation to know when the desert is large. The map does not lead outward so much as inward, into the understanding that a carefully kept list is a kind of shelter. If the caches existed, someone followed these directions by lamplight the way you get from bed to the kitchen at midnight, with small, sure steps and no need to bump into furniture. If they did not exist, the list still performed a service. It allowed its makers to sleep, which is often the point of any treasure. And so the ribbons of copper lie flat enough to be read and curved enough to remember their former shape. The letters count. The desert declines to reply. The reader drifts in the pleasantly repetitive geometry of talents and cubits and steps, which is a very good geometry for sleep. Somewhere, a conservator writes another report with the ceremonial calm of someone adding one more neat card to a drawer. Somewhere else, A scholar is happily revising a footnote about the proper reading of a preposition that points either east or slightly east, which is as fine a difference as any bedtime needs. The scroll's edges catch the light and release it slowly, the way cities do when seen from far away. No resolution arrives. You close your eyes, and the words, at the entrance to the cave, keep walking, gentle and precise, until they are simply the entrance to whatever quiet you were looking for. You might not expect a treasure list to be louder than the treasure, but this one is made of copper and insists on being heard with your fingertips. It lives in careful light now, but in the beginning it rested in a cave that sounded like a pantry, dry, even full of little shelves the wind made out of dust. Cave 3 is not romantic, which helps. The less a place tries to impress you, the more reliably it tells time. A team found the rolled sheet there, thick as a small loaf, stubborn as a hinge. Someone tapped it, and it rang with the tired dignity of an old kettle. If you're still awake by the time I get to the part about how many minas make a talent, feel free to subscribe. If you are not, imagine the soft clink of numbers stacking themselves into neat piles and let them lean gently. The copper was not inclined to unfold for company, so conservators who are professionally polite to objects sliced it into long ribbons that still wanted to be a tube. Each strip remembered a curve the way a cat remembers a windowsill after you have moved the chair. The letters, cut rather than drawn, rose from the surface like shallow furrows after rain. They are Hebrew of the sensible sort, clean verbs, business-like nouns, not much room for adjectives to loiter. A list has no time to admire itself. Where other scrolls would sing, this one clears its throat and says, "Go to the cistern at the valley as fork and measure 9 cubits toward the east." There is something calming about instructions that trust you to know what a stair is. The writer, whose hand presses with consistent weight, does not spend energy on comparison. He does not say, like very often, he names a place that is solid, the steps by the salt water, the entrance to the cave, the third terrace, and then he provides a depth or a cardinal nod that feels like a hand gesture. Some phrases repeat the way habits do, at the mouth, at the corner. In the cistern, always with a number that would make a good lullaby if you like counting forearms, because a cubit is exactly that. When the text pauses to mention jars, you can sense the relief of any sensible organizer. Coins are not fun loose, they need a home with a lid. The measures are big enough to make the elbows of your imagination feel heavy. A talent is a weight you negotiate with, not a sum you brag about. A mina is an argument you can carry in both hands. The list is oddly humane about mass, like someone who has moved house too many times. The obvious question is why a list like this would be written on copper, which ages into the color of old lakes and insists on taking scratches personally. Parchment and papyrus are friendlier, but they need weather to be in a good mood. Copper does not care who is in charge of the humidity. It shrugs at insects and tells fire to go comb its hair. You can almost hear the sponsor someone sensible with an appreciation for cost-benefit saying, "Write it where time can't heckle it." The scribe obliged with a stylus that bit a little but never chewed, ruling straight guidelines with a chalked string and running the letters along them like carts on tracks. Where he changed his mind, he did so quietly, shaving one numeral into another the way a carpenter corrects a notch. You can see the hesitations if you stare, which is a good way to pass the moment before sleep, staring at small corrections and trusting that other people have also recounted their jars. The landscape those directions enter is not modest. Wadis are temporary and enthusiastic. A terrace is loyal until it isn't. Marker stones practice the ancient art of being stones in general. When you read by the third step, you realize you must already know which steps count as steps in this conversation. The scroll expects a kind of local fluency, a shared memory of which reservoir mattered and which one merely held opinions. It is like getting directions from an uncle who assumes you remember the house that used to be there. This is not a failure of clarity, it is a kind of security. The fewer adjectives, the more the landscape itself has to answer. That may be why the writing feels so steady. It is not trying to solve the desert, it is trying to outlast it. Precision survives where location does not. If a terrace collapses, the depth in cubits is still patient and applicable elsewhere, like a piece of furniture that fits in any room. Scholars, with the patience that grows in people who read for a living, have taken the scroll apart the way a topographer takes apart a hill with contour lines. They've matched letter forms to centuries, tested the alloy for its preferences in tin, listened with microscopes to the tiny chatter of tool marks. Reading copper becomes a kind of hiking. The grooves are miniature wadis. The ruled lines are as straight as roads want to be. The lamplight used during unrolling leaves its own memory, but the older marks tell the better story. There, a stroke leans a little as the hand reaches across the sheet. Here, a corner deepens to convince a reluctant serif. If handwriting is a person's weather, this scribe's climate was climate-controlled. He sat in a room that sounded like a warehouse, breath-cool, repetitive, inventory season every day. You can almost smell the oil on the lamp, faint and purposeful, and hear a stylus make the same small sound a tailor's chalk makes on cloth. Of course, people looked for what the list suggested. They brought rods, maps, measuring tapes that made a quiet zipper of numbers as they unfurled, and a respectful optimism that is the proper uniform for archaeologists and gardeners alike. The desert allowed them to dig where digging could be done and responded to questions with sand's usual courtesy, which is to become other sand a little to the left. Staircases turned up, the desert is good at admitting to stairs, and cisterns confessed to their shapes, but not their former contents. Holes opened and revealed other holes. A rumor or two sat down to rest as legends. Every find was correct enough to stay interesting and wrong enough to demand lunch. Treasure that stayed underground, as one patient report merely said, because this is what treasure does best when your spade is not in the exact part of the exact step, named by a person who did not believe in adjectives. What fascinates, long after the shovels are idle, is the arithmetic. If you obediently add the talents and minas and their friends, you get a number that makes accountants lean back, remove their glasses, and say, in a way that means 3 paragraphs but only spends 1 syllable. Entire budgets could be moved by these sums if they existed altogether anywhere besides paper, which is the polite debate. Were these caches real and multiple, like lanterns set along a path, so the path continues if one goes out? Or was the list a decoy, confident and shiny, meant to send a future trouble elsewhere while another plan went about its business? The decoy theory has style. It imagines caretakers who understood that people trust metal more than intuition, and who knew that there is nothing so convincing as a well-mannered list that tells you what you want to hear in the tone of someone who has already packed the bags. But the sincere theory has comfort. It suggests a community setting aside its bright things in a distributed ledger of dirt, trusting that someday calm hands would retrace their steps. Both theories sleep well. The scroll declines to choose. Science is polite about maybes. Laboratory voices, which are soft in their own disciplined way, say the alloy is ancient, the patina honest, the cuts consistent with a practice point. Radii of curvature on the unrolled ribbons whisper how tightly the sheet once believed in being a cylinder. Spectrometers hum and produce spectra that look like night skies where elements blink instead of stars. Ground-penetrating radar glides over terraces and sends back pictures that resemble cake layers you are not allowed to eat. Drones make maps that look like thoughtful quotes. Computers take the entries and lay them across topography like a transparent recipe over a bowl. Somewhere a graduate student changes likely to highly likely, and then back again. And the footnote sighs not in frustration but in contentment. There's something restful about a verdict that ends again and again with unproven hoards. One detail that never stops being charming is the matter of seals. The list cares about containers and closures the way cooks care about lids. It understands that a seal turns a jar into a decision. A sealed jar can change owners more politely. It can move through time without catching a cold. The scroll's affection for sealing makes sense when you notice its affection for witnesses that are made of stone. Entrances, corners, stairs. Even the containers behave like architecture. There's also the faint possibility that the list was once accompanied by another list, a companion that explained nicknames, because nicknames always bloom whenever the official names sound like minutes from a meeting. The third cistern on the north side is how you label a receipt, not how you talk to your friend. If a second document existed, it has remained devoted to the art of absence. The existing list functions like a key that assumes you already own the lock it opens. My favorite mental exercise, good for quiet evenings and slow lids, is to track one entry as if it were a cat weaving through table legs. You pick, say, under the steps at the salt water, and you imagine which steps a person who wrote in this tone would bother to describe. You count 9 cubits in a direction that turns a little because Desert East has a sense of humor, and then you find a stone that doesn't match the others in exactly the way all stones look similar. You set down your tools because you have earned the right to look at the horizon for a minute. Then you dig, and the ground decides it will be gentle today. Perhaps you discover a jar that someone once sealed, and it contains not coins, but the space where coins might have been, which is an excellent metaphor and not a failure. Or perhaps it truly contains what it says, and you add up the talent's weight with the same careful breath as your distant predecessor. Either result suits sleep. The surety is in the doing, not the finding. The most valuable thing about a list is often the walk it invites. There are pieces of language here that you can take to bed like smooth pebbles. At the entrance to the cave, by the conduit at the valley's fork, under the third step, each phrase holds double. It is literal enough to point at careful person's boots, and abstract enough to be a way to think about anxiety. Entrances exist, conduits fork, third steps happen. Put something heavy there, says the text, and rest. If the caches never were, the advice still holds. Distribute your certainty among places that do not move much. If the caches did exist and were later found by hands that did not report back, the list still wins the argument with time by continuing to be legible. Copper has that vanity. It believes it can outpatient everyone else. It is usually right. I find myself imagining the original reading someone holding the new made sheet, warm in spots where straightening it left finger heat, and reciting in a room that preferred silence. The audience may have been 2 people or 3, or only the scribe checking his work aloud to the small attention of a lamp. The clauses would have landed with the solidity of small stones on a bench. Place, measure, container, seal. No adjectives raised their hands. The last line would not have been a flourish. It would have been the next chore. That tone remains. Now the scroll lies under controlled air, and visitors float past with the patient expression people wear in rooms with labels. They read. They nod at words that like to be nodded at, and the scroll approves without needing them to be excited. Its job is to continue existing. It does that well enough to relax other ambitions. And so the copper scroll keeps offering the same quiet entertainment, a set of directions that refuses to hurry, and a set of numbers that choose not to brag. It promises nothing, and in doing so promises company. The act of reading it becomes a walk among sensible nouns. Each time you reach at the entrance to the cave, your breathing settles into the pace of steps that know where the stair is. The desert outside goes on changing its mind politely. The laboratory goes on humming. The footnotes stretch, yawn, and adjust their conclusions by half a sentence. Somewhere, a new terrace fails gracefully and becomes slope, and somewhere else a jar that never left its hole continues to be a jar perfectly. The list has done what careful lists do. It has made a path for mind and body to follow without tripping over urgency. If sleep arrives while you are halfway across the valley's fork, the cistern will still be there in the morning, exactly as precise and as unhelpful as before, which is, in this case, exactly right. You might not expect a list to be heavier than the things it lists, but the copper scroll is exactly that kind of practical joke. It looks like someone rolled up a short brown scatter, wrote on it with a stubborn nail, and then asked future readers to bring patience and a lamp. The day it came out of Cave 3, the light in the room behaved like a clerk, efficient, quiet, and not at all surprised. Conservators tested a corner and found that copper ages into the color of old money and the attitude of old cats. It does not unroll just because you ask nicely. In the end, they sliced the cylinder into obedient strips, and the strips kept their memory of being curved the way a sleeping hand keeps its idea of a cup. The letters are Hebrew in a mood we could call warehouse calm. No metaphors. Almost no adjectives, just nouns and numbers that stack without squeaking. The writing is cut into the metal rather than floated on top of it, which means you can read with your fingertips if the lamp is shy. If you're still awake later, feel free to subscribe with the gentlest possible click, somewhere between a nod and the closing of a notebook. But honestly, if your eyelids decide to fold like parchment in a dry room, that is the more traditional response to ancient inventory. The first thing the scroll tells you, in tones usually reserved for delivery instructions left under a stone, is to go to a place by the mouth of a cave, or the third step of a staircase, or a cistern with ideas about depth. Then it asks you to measure in cubits, which is the friendliest of units because it is just the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. A unit that travels with you like a personal ruler that comes pre-installed. The sums feel deliberate, talents and minas that would make your wrists consider early retirement. A talent is something like the weight of a very decisive toddler. A mina is the weight of a well-fed loaf. Numbers like that hush a room without raising their voice. The copper itself is the comedy and the lesson. Paper flirts with fire. Parchment sulks in damp weather, but copper is a colleague who shows up no matter what the sky is doing. It oxidizes into a green that looks expensive and then keeps working. You can feel the decision in the choice of metal. This was meant to live through times that would not be. Sympathetic to stationery. Somewhere in the production chain, a scribe stood over a sheet of hammered copper and pressed letters into it, with a stylus that left grooves tidy enough to please any careful eye. Tool marks are whittled whispers. Where he corrected himself, you can see a numeral eased into another numeral, like a chair scooted an inch to the left. Lines were ruled, likely with a chalked string, because even a list about treasure likes its sentences to march in straight columns. The sound of writing on copper is not musical. It is a soft scratch with a little weight behind it, the sonnet cousin of a file card being pushed into the back of a drawer. You can imagine the room agreeing, "This is fine, carry on." And the scribe did, with a rhythm that makes you think of a horse at a slow walk, every letter another step on a reliable road. There's no flattery in the text and no audience but future feet. The scroll is not telling a story. It is reminding someone who already knew most of this where to put their hands. What it names are places that behave like furniture in a house you have not visited for years but could still navigate in the dark. The third step. The entrance to the cave. The fork in the valley where the water remembers to make a choice. You can sense the confidence of someone who expected you to be standing there soon. The descriptions are precise without being photographic, which is how old directions manage to survive landscapes that keep practicing the art of changing their mind. A terrace collapses into a slope. A wadi chooses a different bed. A marker stone forgets which face was north. The words remain at the same height, blinking patiently, like porch lights that turn on whether or not you ever come home. Because of that tone calm, practical, mildly bored with adjectives, reading the scroll feels like listening to a friend who folds maps into perfect squares while talking. It also invents its own kind of humor. Under the steps of the saltwater sounds like a punchline. If you've ever tried to define step when the staircase is partly theoretical. At the conduit's mouth could be the dessert order of a very shy engineer. The scroll has dozens of these tiny moments where language forgives topography for being untidy. They happen so frequently that you begin to hear them as lullaby refrains, at the corner, at the mouth, at the third step, at the pool. The second scene opens the way a drawer opens, with the quiet promise of a plan that has already been inventory. People have looked, of course. That is what people do when a list wears a tone of confidence like a well-cut coat. Teams measured cubits with tapes that unfurl like calm snakes, paced terraces that held their breath, and let sand return to sand in little polite avalanches. Stairs were found because stairs are excellent at being stairs long after buildings forget their names. Cisterns turned up their stone lips and admitted to depth. And frequently, the desert answered like a very old witness at a trial. Yes, that is the place, and no, I will not comment on contents. The rumor economy did good business. Every quiet hole suggested that a louder hole existed somewhere else. Reports settled into the most soothing grammar archaeology has, careful nouns, past tense verbs, and adverbs used only when the day earned them. The thing that never lost its balance was the math. If you add the weights, the total sits down beside you with the authority of a sleeping dog. It is too much to be a prank and exactly enough to be tempting. If you are still somehow awake, feel invited to notice how the scroll's numbers keep their hats on in public, never waving their arms, merely accruing like interest. What makes scholars happily, sleepily argumentative is not only the where, but the who behind such thoroughness. Some see temple administrators who treated the landscape as a safety deposit box, distributing lumens of value across darkness so no single accident could blow out the season. Others imagine a coalition of cautious neighbors acting in a hurry that learned how not to sound hurried. A smaller, stylish minority votes for decoy, a document built to move the eyes of thieves in the wrong direction, while the real plan traveled under other names. There is even room for the possibility of two truths. The scroll writes confidently about real places and real measures, and then uses that confidence as camouflage for something else. In all cases, the copper choice remains the same steady joke. Whatever happens to the history, the text continues to be a text. Copper is like that colleague who keeps copies of every email and also their attachments. It is difficult to argue with a metal that refuses melodrama. The scroll's quiet humor is that it might successfully document the presence of either treasure or practicality. Both, at the proper hour of the night, are the same thing. The third scene belongs to the hunt, which in this version of reality is more choreography than chase. Security is not gates and guards. It is repeated verbs and familiar nouns, performed slowly in many places. The scroll loves seals the way bakers love lids. A sealed jar is a promise that learned to sit still. The list treats jars like minor architectural features, each one a room for decisions. It also helps to imagine that there was once another document, a companion with nicknames and gestures, the internal glossary that turns third cistern on the north into the one that smells like figs. If such a key existed, it has been exemplary at keeping quiet. That silence produces the sort of treasure story that puts you to sleep in the gentlest way. Every excavation confirms the list's sense of space and refuses to decide the list's sense of money. Holes are honest. They open, they show their profile, and they say nothing on behalf of former contents. You could call this result disappointing. It is, in fact, a stable delight. Each negative find strengthens the scroll as a work of geography. Each positive maybe strengthens it as a work of money. Either way, it keeps doing its main job, which is to be itself. There's another pleasure here that rarely earns applause, but deserves a blanket. The way scholarship uses tools on copper as if reading were carpentering. Raking light slides across the grooves and dramatizes old decisions. Radiography peaks without poking. Spectroscopy measures the element's biography, then leans back as if it has just smelled the age of a coin. Computer models take the coordinates, such as they are, and lay them over the hills like a transparent recipe. You can see where a wadi once preferred to sleep, and where a terrace grew tired and sat down to become slope. This is archaeology as bedtime craft. The hands that type the reports follow the same rhythm as the stylus that once made the letters, steady, consistent, modestly proud of spelling. Meanwhile, the debates are cordial. Authentic text, unproven hordes, is the kind of sentence that arranges the pillows and turns the lamp to the pleasingly low setting between on and not on. Within these hunts, there are the tiny absurdities that a drowsy brain welcomes. There is the measuring tape that gets sand in its teeth and has to be scolded back into its case. There is a stare that refuses to decide which of its stones counts as the third step and proceeds to offer 4 equally good candidates. There is the team that argues for an entire polite hour whether a cubit measured on a tall graduate student should be averaged with a cubit measured on the short supervisor for fairness. There is the jar-shaped shadow that keeps being a shadow whatever you do to it. And there is the unmistakable joy in writing the words, "No artifacts recovered," with the same care you would use to list a small fortune. It's not indifference. It's the opposite, the understanding that a trustworthy no builds a stronger story than a hurried yes. The copper scroll inspires that kind of literary neatness in field notes, and no object could ask for better friends. Asterisk, asterisk. The 4th scene returns to the scroll itself and reads it as terrain. Those grooves have edges like ridges, a miniature mountain range sculpted by a patient point. If you tilt the sheet under soft light, clouds of shadow travel across the letters like weather. Corrections bloom where the scribe hesitated. Perhaps a digit needed to borrow a serif, or a little punctuation wanted to audition for a new position. Experts compare these habits to other documents, argue about date with the contented industry of bees, and arrive mostly at the same flower, late Second Temple period, manufactured with enough tin to keep the copper spry, and inscribed with a point that had a consistent personality. The language, too, has a flavor. Biblical Hebrew with business-like elbows, the kind that holds a gate open and does not ask for thanks. The verdict, written in a gentle voice that articles learn after their 20th proofread, is calm. The sheet is what it claims to be, a real thing from a real time, bearing a real inventory in a tone that suggests the foreman will be displeased if anyone crunches the numbers too loudly. If the caches were real, and some hands found them in a quiet century and told no, one because telling is rarely part of finding, then the copper scroll is the rare case, where a list achieved its purpose and still refuses to stop being interesting. If they were a plan that never came off, the text remains the best kind of plan, the kind that makes it easy for the next person to try again with dignity. And if the list was a decoy, brilliant in its modesty, then it works so well that we are still politely reading it instead of looking wherever the planner meant us to look. Each option is a lullaby with different harmonies. All of them turn the same refrain in the mind, at the entrance, under the 3rd step, at the mouth of the conduit, 9 cubits toward the east. Some nights, the most useful speculation is the simplest. Picture a small group in a cool room, the copper still smelling faintly of hammer and fire, The scroll is read aloud, not for drama, but for verification. The reader's voice is even. A clerk in the corner keeps count on a tablet with marks like weathered fence boards. Someone asks a question about the difference between a jar and a vessel, and the group agrees, without interest, that the distinction will not matter to the ground. The lamp burns like a slow coin. When the reading ends, there is no conclusion, only a nod with the speeds of agreement. The room empties. The list continues to be the list. It is an excellent routine for falling asleep by. Nothing urgent arrives. Nothing insists. Even the numbers lean back like chairs that understand themselves. If you drift, you do not miss anything that cannot be read again from the same line tomorrow. What the copper scroll teaches, perhaps accidentally, is the restful art of precise descriptions that do not try to solve the world. You can live a decent life with by the entrance, under the step, 9 cubits, and silt jar without demanding adjectives to embroider each sleeping noun. There's even a small philosophy in the way the text dislikes flourish. It believes with admirable certainty that location and measure will suffice. That a seal is a promise, even if nobody sees the promise kept. That copper, if asked, will remember your intentions long after the reasons for them have retired. It is the opposite of drama and the opposite of denial. It is simply a way to leave instructions the earth can store dots, so we end not with a reveal, but with a steady blinking cursor of a thought. The scroll lies in its case, comfortable as a ruler on a desk. Scholars pass and tourists pass, and the desert passes outside in the form of wind rearranging its punctuation. From time to time, another survey uses a new instrument that hums like a cat. The map grows a contour. The debate grows a footnote, and the list, which has always preferred to be read by people who do not mind reading again, keeps offering itself as bedtime material, a treasure catalog that treasures the act of cataloging more than the act of collecting, a heavy sheet whose sentences make you feel light, a document that refuses to be found in the exciting sense and instead arranges, with severe politeness, to be found in the sleepy sense. If you let your eyes close now, the third step will still be waiting. The mouth of the conduit will still be the same patient oval, and the cubit, whichever arm you bring, will be exactly the length you need, which is to say, just long enough to reach the switch and turn the day softly down. You might not expect the calm history of pencil sharpeners to have a soundtrack, but if you listen closely, all the late 19th century models hum in the same key, a small brass sigh that repeats until a cone of cedar appears like a polite tornado. The first sharpeners were not the familiar wall-mounted cranks. They were pocketable blade and groove contraptions that resembled tin thimbles with ambition. Carpenters had been pointing graphite for centuries with knives that did not care about uniformity. Students, it turned out, liked points that looked as if the day had already been arranged for them. French inventors could not resist gears. Patents after 1847 described tiny houses for cutting wheels, each window labeled with a number that stood for elegance. Americans added a clamp because tables are social, and nothing unsettles a classroom like an object that refuses to stay put. If you're still awake later on, you can subscribe with the same energy it takes to tighten a desk screw a quarter turn, almost none at all. But if you drift, the shavings will keep spiraling without you. Early models had names that sound like minor characters in gentle novels. The planetary, the little giant. The no one improved. A clerk would write to the factory and request 36 planetaries as if ordering the weather. The instructions were always brief. Insert, rotate. Avoid excitement. The wall crank sharpener found its natural habitat in schools. As soon as walls began to admit responsibility for everything that happened near them. The bracket went shoulder high, a democratic height arrived at by averaging everyone who complained. Custodians dealt with the bracket with a fin wrench and the expression of a dentist who has seen this mouth before. Teachers developed the ritual we still recognize, an even look, a nod toward the device, and the unspoken contract that the walk there and back is part of education. In the 1890s, classrooms smelled like wet wool and chalk. The sharpener added the domestic scent of cedar, which many reports call stimulating, as if the wood were a mild coffee for pencils. It did subtle work on the social order. Short trips to the crank became a minute-long democracy where truce was called on whatever debate had lived at the back table. Children discovered that the same pencil, turned at the same speed, produced either a confession of shavings or nothing at all, depending on whether the operator looked at the window or the floor. The crank taught patience more gently than arithmetic did. It also taught small secrets like how to press the pencil slightly upward so the blade takes more from one side, and just like that, every handwriting slants with intention dot. There were countless designs, and all of them managed to say, without speaking, "I am very sure about cones." The planetary used 2 helical cutters that courted each other inside a small cast iron theater. The Boston models wore tin labels that suggested they had studied at good schools. The APSCO was a friendly cube with a drawer like a librarian's wink. In classrooms where budgets were dreams written on paper towels, someone would bring a hand sharpener from home shaped like a bullet, a thimble, a violin, or the Eiffel Tower. The sort with a single razor blade were practical until they bit the fingers of anyone who tried to find the shaving hole while reading. Every model produced the same soft mountain of curls, which an observant child could test against the texture of hair, wool, cracker crumbs, and the surface of peach skin. The shavings were a language of their own. Some curled like fusilli, others fell like crescent moons. When students were asked to draw a map, some of them gave the sharpener its own country, a peninsula with coastal ridges, a capital called Crank, a river named Cedar. Administrators, who must organize the quiet in any building, tried to standardize the noise. Manuals recommended sharpening intervals, as if pencils were trains that needed timetables. There were memos about pre-bell sharpening, a concept impossible to enforce without a bell that could declare the world already sharp enough. One superintendent in Ohio calculated that an average class lost 23 minutes a week to pointing, which is either a statistic or a poem about attention. Procurement officers, with the famous dignity of those who sign checks, debated between replaceable blade models and those that required the entire cutter assembly to be swapped out like a tiny engine. The conservative school districts favored models built like anvils, because children are not known for being historically gentle. Progressives argued for transparent housings that let students see the patient geometry happening inside. Watching the gears turn was, for many, the first experience of engineering that did not require the risk of fire. Every catalog promised no chatter and even taper, and every classroom learned how to tell when both promises had been exaggerated with love. Maintenance belonged to an informal priesthood. Someone had the key to the shavings drawer, a minor relic that granted power over dust. Once a week, usually on a Friday, the drawer was emptied into a bin that spoke cedar under the janitor's breath. In winter, the shavings went damp and explained themselves by clumping. Some schools sprinkled a pinch into the coal scuttle, which did nothing except make the boiler room smell faintly like a pencil factory daydream. A teacher with a good ear could diagnose blade fatigue by sound. The crank's initial confidence would become a confessional rasp, and the device would begin to argue that everyone liked blunt writing anyway. Blades got replaced in the same way teachers changed their tone in May. The screws were small but decisive. On some models, the blade unit came out like a loaf from a pan. On others, it refused to budge and reminded everyone that tools invented by committees prefer to remain at the committee table. When a sharpener was new, it produced a perfect school day metaphor. Things begin rough and end ready. When it aged, it produced a different metaphor. Things begin ready and end friendly. Ergonomics arrived and discovered that wrists were attached to people who sometimes had feelings about them. Experts recommended a steady pace, neither coffee grinder nor hesitant weather vane. Manuals from the 1930s advised placing the left hand on top of the unit to prevent wobbles, a tip that turned generations of children into minor machinists. Some sharpeners had adjustable collars labeled 1 through 8, a numeric horoscope. The lower numbers promised stubby points for pencils with a future in carpentry. The higher numbers delivered aristocratic needles that poked through paper just enough to let ambition breathe. Students learned with the speed of water finding the lowest ground, which setting produced the least homework. The argument between pointy and durable was the classroom's quiet political party system. Underneath it all was graphite, a soft citizen with expectations of privacy. A very sharp point meant fast, dark lines and a quick need to return to the wall. A duller point meant endurance and the faint disappointment of pale text. Somewhere in the middle lived the legendary school point, robust enough to survive a paragraph, elegant enough to let loops pretend to be calligraphy. The shavings themselves built a small museum. Teachers saved them without confessing why. Some poured them into jars where they settled like autumn leaves, arranged by someone who respected spirals. Craftspeople used them for sachets, where the cedar politely overshadowed the perfume. There were projects involving gluing the curls into wreaths that looked, from far away, like successful noodles. On rainy days, a charismatic substitute would let the class press the shavings into clay to make what the lesson plan called fossils of ordinary effort. Janitors, who knew the weight of everything, insisted that a full drawer was lighter than it looked, as if the curls had negotiated a discount with gravity. The color of the shavings changed through the century as pencil companies flirted with species, first red cedar, then incense cedar, then other woods that volunteered to be pencils because they liked to be thin. Every change was reported by the sharpener without commentary. The curls were proof that the day had happened, and the drawer was the silent archive that did not know the word curator, but did the work anyway. The sharpener also arranged time. In classrooms, the journey to the crank was one of the few sanctioned walks, a mini recess that fit inside serious minutes. Children discovered the choreography: stand, hold pencil upwards like a passport, ask with eyes, receive the teacher's yes that weighed exactly as much as a nod, walk past the poster about rivers and set one hand on the cool metal as if greeting an aunt. The crank's rhythm set the tempo for micro gossip. 2 revolutions meant just a moment. 5 meant I am on an errand, and 7 was the international. Sign for this pencil has seen things. Teachers noticed that disputes about the red crayon could dissolve during those revolutions. It is difficult to maintain outrage while manufacturing a cone. In quieter schools, you could hear an entire class thinking by the sequence of words. In louder schools, the crank was an island with its own weather, a small tornado that cared only about a tidy future. At home, kitchen sharpeners lived in drawers between measuring spoons and postcards from family members who wrote in important capital letters. Parents sharpened on Sunday nights, a ritual that made Monday smell better than Monday deserved. There were small absurdities. One model advertised a patented lead-saving feature that, upon inspection, simply stopped working if you turned it faster than it preferred. Another included a miniature bell that rang when the point was ready, a device guaranteed to announce success exactly 3 seconds after everyone could already see the point. A district office tried a policy where sharpeners were checked out like books. Their serial numbers were recorded in a ledger under the heading Edges, which is both literal and poetic. A rural school in winter kept its crank near the stove, resulting in pencils so warm that notes written just after sharpening might as well have been toasted. The postage on replacement blades was often higher than the price of the blades. A domestic illustration of economics that made every secretary sigh a little. And there was the famous instruction printed on a small leaflet: turn in the direction of patience, which settled, for anyone paying attention, the question of whether these devices could teach character. After the Second World War, plastics arrived with their cheerful vowels, and sharpeners learned to be cute. Colors appeared. The familiar cube became a sphere, then a novelty shoe, then a dinosaur that ate hexagonal prey. Desk trays incorporated small domed sharpeners, like observatories for tiny astronomers. The wall crank remained, anchored by tradition and the fact that it had already learned where to live. When electric models arrived, they called attention to every decision. Early motors pleaded. Later ones bragged. The best of them murmured like a sleep machine set to attentive ocean. Some schools bought them and then put them in the staff room because they felt like a perk rather than a public utility. The old mechanicals stayed in classrooms and turned stubbornness into tenure. You could tell a building's age by counting the cranks and subtracting the number of busy outlets. Even in offices, the crank hung on because it was morally neutral. Electric models suggested urgency. The crank suggested a reasonable future. People who do crosswords swear by the quiet cone a manual machine makes, as if that perfect point might know something about 13-letter words. The decline that followed was more of a yawn than a tragedy. Mechanical pencils, which are really small pens with crayon soles, removed the adventure. Digital classrooms replaced writing with tapping. No one sharpens a finger. The cranks gathered a light coat of chalk that remembered when people still clapped erasers like applauding mangoes. Some got removed, leaving 2 holes in the wall that resembled eyes with good self-esteem. Yet the survivors were loyal. Tutors prefer them. Art rooms adore them. Test days revive them. There's something in the partnership of hand, wood, and blade that reintroduces us to the idea of effort without anxiety. A manual sharpener does not ask for power, only understanding. It forgives the crooked, grants a second chance to the broken, and makes a small celebration out of readiness. It lets the room breathe in cedar, which is what the word prepared might smell like if it decided to have a scent. If we were to end anywhere, it would be in the shavings drawer, a museum of spirals. Consider one curl, a thin biography of a tree that learned to listen to graphite. Its edges are neat, its center remembers the pencil's first near circle, and its texture is the exact opposite of urgency. Press a fingertip into the pile and it springs back with what can only be described as optimism. This is what sharpeners do more than making points. They manufacture small, consistent optimism. They promise that dullness is temporary, that patience makes geometry, that turning a handle softly can turn a day softly too. Even the sound is medicinal, a zipper pulled on the air. Somewhere right now, because there is always a classroom somewhere, is the first minute after lunch. A child walks to the wall. The crank turns 4, then 5, then 6 times. Cedar enters the room like a well-behaved forest, and a point appears that is not dramatic, not heroic, not worth a headline, just exactly ready. If you feel yourself drifting, the device approves. A sharpener understands cycles. It would be pleased to know you will return when you need to, turn the handle once or twice in the direction of patience, and let the quiet cone appear again, neat as a thought you didn't have to hurry to finish. You might not expect a small wedge of wood to shape the way air moves through a century, but doorstops have always been the engineers of a room's mood. The earliest ones were not really objects at all, just stones with opinions. Archaeologists find them in thresholds that have outlived the houses, an oval pebble worn on one side as if it had spent a long afternoon leaning toward a door and making quiet. Incremental arguments about openness. In hot places, a prop door was a breeze contract. In cold places, it was a draft you negotiated only when soup was on the fire. The first carpentered wedges appear in account books as staves, which is practical and somehow parental. A stay does not shout. It holds the line and then goes to bed early. The simplest wedges were made from offcuts, the triangular end of a board pushed into service by the same hand that had just told children to keep their boots outside. Can almost hear that hand thinking, this is a problem for gravity. If you are still awake later, feel free to subscribe to more slow arguments with physics, but honestly, don't strain yourself. The door will still be here. A wedge looks like progress that refuses to hurry. The geometry is modest. The angle tells the floor I am reasonable. Ships had wedges to keep cargo from pretending to be rivers. Shops had them to make thresholds into imitations. Houses had them because a door that will not stay where it is put feels suspiciously independent. Early laws mention the door bar, the opposite of a doorstop. Really yet, behind every heavy bar, there must have been an equally heavy moment of, could we leave it open just for a bit? Monks recorded wains as if the weather were a memorable guest. They listed which cloister. Doors needed stones in the afternoons when the Balfour nun agreed with the sea breeze. A stone borrowed from the garden bed acquired, in time, a flat side and a name. There's no famous doorstop, which is exactly how doorstops prefer fame. They succeed by being remembered only when forgotten, the way you remember a bookmark when the page has already been found. The Renaissance produced grand thresholds that were not meant to be tired. Yet even a door carved with saints behaves like any other door when it meets a stubborn wedge. In house inventories next to pewter and linen, you occasionally find one. Hold for the door, priced in pennies, valued in patience. Kitchens standardized wedges the way they standardize spoons. The line cook with a slot of pine was not different in principle from the steward with a brass weight shaped like a lemon. Some households adopted the shoes as doorstop method, a custom that blends domestic improvisation with the practical knowledge that heavy shoes can be found faster than good ideas. Letters from the 18th century mention a boot to keep the entry friendly, which is the sort of sentence that usually presumes a roaring dog just outside the frame. Sailors took wooden wedges ashore, where they discovered that a wedge, designed to keep cannons from rolling, could keep a tavern door conversational. At this point, we might note a minor absurdity. The more decorative the door, the plainer the wedge. Ornament, it seems, prefers to rest on simple geometry. The 19th century made a hobby of domestic atmosphere, and doorstops became decor that accidentally prevented concussions. Cast iron animals appear in catalogs with the calm certainty of pets that will never need feeding. A spaniel with an alert expression promised to protect carpets from drafts and perhaps, if asked nicely, stop talking about foxes, rabbits, cats. Beehives, baskets of fruit, every shape available in iron also appears 2 pages later as a doorstop. The iron could be painted or left to practice dignity. Houses in damp climates learned the subtle arithmetic of rust versus ventilation. A homeowner could choose the slow orange of oxidation, which colored the fingertips like paprika, or the slow gray of stale rooms. Hardware stores offered thick rubber wedges around 1880. Advertisements explained rubber by calling it elastic, as though that word could be sliced thin and served on toast. The rubber wedge did not split, which made it valuable to people who were tired of the small heartbreak of a wooden wedge's first crack. Hotels developed a working relationship with doorstops the way they develop friendships with mops. A door held at the right angle lets a hallway feel generous. Held at the wrong angle, it argues with luggage about who is responsible for corners. Housekeepers tucked specialized wedges into apron pockets like spare thoughts. Bellhops learned the 2-finger stoop, the one that sets the wedge and checks for compliments from gravity. There were etiquette discussions about how far to prop. A door when a guest was expected shortly enough to signal welcome, not enough to expose the suitcase that is always on its least flattering side. In boarding houses, the universal wedge created a temporary society. A row of half-open doors on laundry day said more about trust than any manifesto. Boarding houses, like doorstops, preferred adjectives such as decent, clean, reliable. Good linens, steady wedges, no surprises, the domestic wish list of a century. Factories and schools entered the story with heavy doors and heavier schedules. Fire codes matured like careful fruit. Once, open doors meant rescue, then closed doors meant safety. The doorstop had to negotiate these contradictions without speaking. Kick-down stops appeared, those hinged metal legs that live near the hinge and flick down with a satisfying suggestion, but they have made up their mind. They belong to an age that liked levers and confidence. Magnetic hold-opens arrived with electricity and a sense of duty. Wired to the alarm, they release doors at the first serious thought of smoke. In old buildings, you can still see the ghosts. Rectangles of brighter paint where magnets or brackets once stood. A pale biography of caution. The doorstop became something that might be illegal in certain corridors on certain days. Janitors learned the quiet skill of unwedging, a task almost as delicate as wedging, but with more apologizing. In houses, drafts were both enemy and friend, depending on which month it was and whether somebody's aunt was visiting. Draft snakes appeared, tubes stuffed with sawdust or polite sand, settle on the threshold where they accomplished the exact opposite of a doorstop while being cousins in spirit. Families that saved string also saved wedges. Children discovered that a wedge doubled as a toy ramp, then grew up and insisted they had always respected hardware. The century's catalogs kept inventing, spring-loaded stops that caught the door like a soft-spoken bouncer, floor buttons that rose underfoot with the satisfaction of pressing an elevator, roller stops that paused a door at different degrees of welcome. The language stayed formal, a restraint, a check, a keeper, a stay. This is a profession that does not seek romance. It seeks angles. Some doors ask to stay open without help. The Dutch door, the one yellowed by children's books, needed a wedge only for the bottom half, and only when cows were curious. Screen doors performed their own ungainly ballet with springs that pulled them shut from the last, half-inch with the enthusiasm of a small dog. In summer porches, the wooden block lost to the hard facts of mosquito season. Yet even here, the doorstop shows up as a minute-long truce. We prop the screen for groceries, for lemonade pitchers, for neighbors who lean in to ask whether we have heard the weather. The wedge is most itself during errands. It has the patience to keep a door generous while hands are busy with bags, boxes, small narratives. If you ever want a metric for how calm a street is, count the wedges in summer. The more wedges, the slower the mail. A microchronology helps. Morning, a cafe door wedged open with a brick, steam, and espresso making promises to people who are honest with pastries. Noon, an office holds its glass door with a chrome foot, so the delivery of sandwiches looks like procession rather than ambush. Afternoon, a library wedges quietly, letting the smell of paper reach the sidewalk where a bicyclist considers adulthood and pedals away. Evening, a restaurant experiments with the angle that says the kitchen is not yet tired. Night, the wedge retires, the latch returns to its station, the building closes its eyes. Doorstops do not measure time, but they are the punctuation. Commas everywhere, occasional dashes, rarely a period. The 20th century discovered new materials, which is to say it discovered new reasons to do old things. Soft plastics delivered wedges in colors that suggested both candy and road cones. Silicone learned to grip stubborn tile the way geckos grip vacation ads. Transparent wedges promised invisibility and succeeded until someone tried to find them. At the same time, builders favored automatic closers that swing doors shut with a sigh measured in Newton meters, a unit that feels both sporty and sleepy. Because closers were excellent at their one job, the wedge's job changed from open the door to debate with the closer. An office with a strong closer is a miniature test of philosophy. The wedge attempts reason. The closer insists on policy. Gravity, usually a wedge ally, sides with the closer because the hinge and the spring had a meeting without inviting the floor. Institutions always produce rules. Hospitals, for instance, prefer non-combustible hardware that collaborates with alarms, and even their doorstops wear badges. Hotels now issue small rubber wedges branded with the property's name. They function as both tool and souvenir, though neither is encouraged. Museums practice a strict schedule, doors propped only during installations, never in galleries with paintings that would prefer not to learn about weather. Universities with lecture halls wedge between classes and unwedge when the devotee has thoughts. During fire drills, a special person carries a ring of keys and a small pouch of authority. The pouch contains, like well-raveled talismans, 2 stainless steel wedges, a stubby screwdriver, and a roll of blue tape that is never for taping the latch, but is always theoretically useful. If you must have a micro hook, one campus published a memo titled Door Propping Etiquette, which may be the calmest use of the word etiquette in modern literature. Meanwhile, there is an unrecorded history that lives in closets. Somewhere in almost every building is a shelf with a population of retired wedges. Their angles have been softened by feet. Some have a nail through one end, like a pierced ear. Someone once tied a string so the wedge could be retrieved during busy minutes. Others are trimmed with bite marks, an honest dog bored at eye level. A surprising number are painted because they were made from leftover baseboard. The paint remembers hallways that were once fashionable, avocado green, an optimistic beige, the brown that everyone swears they never used. The closet is a museum without labels. If anyone ever makes a traveling exhibit called Objects That Liked Being Useful, it will need a whole case for wedges and enough lighting to make the shadows look like open doors. Asterisk, asterisk, as with all small technologies. Language followed. Keep the door open is a metaphor with a day job. Writers ask for open doors in publishing. Managers promise them in meetings. Parents create them with their own bodies while carrying laundry. The wedge participates in this metaphor without fuss. It is the literal case that makes the figurative one seem possible. Famously, there is also the Doorstop book, a novel thick enough to prevent a gale from pushing its way into an indifferent room. The Doorstop book neither offends nor moves quickly. It is dependable ballast for furniture that has opinions about wobble. In kitchens, the purse or the bag of potatoes is a doorstop with groceries. On picnics, a folded sweater risks a new career. The principle is always the same. We ask a thing to keep the world gently ajar, and the thing agrees. It is pleasant to imagine a small timeline pinned to the wall. At one end, a river stone with one flexed edge from a doorway that no longer exists. At the other, a silicone wedge the color of a thoughtful cloud, packaged with a barcode and an apology for being more expensive than it appears. Between them, iron animals, brass plinths, long wooden shims cut from baseboard, rubber blocks with the manufacturer's name in cheerful capital letters, magnets that decide the exact moment when a building should become serious, hinges with legs that pivot down like a gymnast who only does one routine. Each item is a way of telling the same story in a different accent. It is the story of air, the story of footsteps, the story of how rooms negotiate with corridors, the way neighbors negotiate over fences politely, with props. And because every prop invites a procedure, we have developed a choreography for doorstops. There is the decisive nudge with the side of the shoe, practiced by people whose hands are already busy with coffee and keys. There is the stoop and place method favored by librarians and anyone who prefers their angles considerate. There's the hallway shuffle, where one person holds the door with an elbow while another slides the wedge with a toe and says, "Got it," with the solemnity of first responders. The sound of a wedge taking responsibility is a small grind, a course of wood against floor. The release is less dramatic, more like a decision taken back unannounced. In very old buildings, the wedge leaves a paler triangle on the floor, a negative portrait of openness that photographs better in late afternoon dots sometimes. A wedge becomes history without intending to. In the record of a factory fire from a century ago, there is a gentle sentence about doors that have been habitually propped, which is both a caution and a portrait of human nature. In wartime memos, doorstops live on lists with sandbags and blackout curtains as if they had enlisted. In a tiny museum in a tiny town, there is a wedge labeled "From the Post Office," used until 1973, a date that gives the object the gravitas of a retiring clerk. If someone tells you an era is over, check the doorways. Wedges move out last. They keep hours like shopkeepers who know exactly when business stops being business and starts being a neighborly excuse to talk about rain. Modern architecture loves glass, which makes doorstops in public buildings vaguely philosophical. A transparent door already looks like an invitation. Holding it more open is like underlining a polite text message. Designers produce sleek aluminum floor stops that resemble punctuation marks fallen from a very clean sentence. Some are hemispheres that let a door kiss and recoil. Others are small posts that stand like exclamation points pretending to be commas. In offices where everything is wheeled and nothing wants permission, mobile whiteboards moonlight as doorstops, and nobody objects because productivity likes furniture with a second job. Retail shops use weighted stanchions, the rope and post arrangement that makes any threshold look like it could testify in court. All of this technology still submits to the original test. Does the door stay where we gently put it? If yes, the room calms. If no, we make the face of someone who has just met a dog that will not sit. Let's end, as doorstops always do, at the floor low, literal, and optimistic. Consider an empty room with a single door. Open it. Now, very slowly, set a small wedge under the edge with 2 fingers. The door leans. The air, newly hired, starts a career. Dust performs its mild ballet. Sounds arrive that would not have bothered to knock. The elevator deciding, the hallway discussing carpet, a distant kettle concluding that steam is a thesis and deserves to be heard. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. A doorstop does not stage events. It schedules comfort. It lets rooms admit the world in careful degrees. The work is not glamorous, though a cast iron cat with a bow would like to remind you it tried. The work is steady, which may be the nicest adjective to fall asleep beside. If, in a few minutes, your eyes close, the wedge will not take it personally. It will hold whatever you set air, quiet, a promise that someone else will return, and it will do so without the need for applause or progress. This is its art. A gentle insistence that a door can be both open and behaved, that movement can be controlled without being scolded, that the middle position is sometimes the perfect one. When morning comes, people will walk through the doorway and forget to think it, which is the highest salary a doorstop earns. The wedge will retreat to the baseboard, or stay where it is, or go back into a pocket, or slip into the closet museum where its cousins live. Another day will find it. Another threshold will admire how such a small angle can make such a measured difference. And if you have drifted by then, the door will still be slightly open, the room breathing in a way that sounds like sleep listening to itself. You might not expect a grocery list hammered into copper to keep scholars awake for 70 years, but the desert has a talent for preserving errands. Picture a rolled cylinder, the color of old coins tucked into the third cave on a quiet limestone cliff. It is not grand. It does not glow. Under a low light, it looks like a pastry that fell asleep. When people first lifted it, it was heavy in the honest way a doorstop is heavy. Coppered is that it takes up space the way a well-fed cat takes up a windowsill. The cylinder would not unroll. The centuries had trained it to prefer its own company. So the experts did what experts sometimes do. They turned the problem into slices. The scroll became strips, and the strips became sentences, and the sentences developed that special tone half map, half memo of someone who once knew exactly what he meant. The letters are Hebrew, but not the temple kind, more like the warehouse kind, careful but brisk. They read like someone tapping a stylus while counting, which is to say, very much like a person. If you're still awake by the time I explain why a treasure list mentions stairs more often than gold, feel free to subscribe. But truly, don't tire yourself. Copper is patient. The thing about writing on copper is that it is, as materials go, stubborn. Parchment is a good conversationalist. Clay tablets are extroverts who love impressions. Copper is an introvert who refuses to forget. People say copper was chosen because fire can't bully it and pests can't snack on it. That is true, and also it sounds like something you tell a child who asked for a bedtime story about metallurgy. The scribe pressed his letters with a sharp point, the way a small, persistent beak might write a diary in the hull of a ship. The language is biblical, yet the mood is managerial. No hymns, no psalms, only directions. The copper holds adjectives like a scale holds coins. Measurements are exact to the point of politeness. So many tones of gold here, so many of silver there. One place marked with pure, as if future readers might be tempted to be disappointed. It feels less like a prophecy and more like a note left on the refrigerator. Please remember the caches. The festival is in 2 weeks. The steps at the saltwater place are tricky. Reading it, you sense a person who loved nouns. He does not say glory. He says cistern. He does not say seek. He says under the stairs. This is how you talk to a future you don't trust to be poetic. Evening. In the cave is mostly limestone learning to be shadow. Imagine a lamp steadying itself, a breath lifting dust the way a moth lifts a curtain. The copper gleams in a way that is not ambitious. Someone sets it on a shelf of rock at shoulder height high enough to feel chosen, low enough to be practical. The desert knows that history happens after lunch. When the finders come, centuries later, they carry the smell of cotton and book glue. They want to unfurl the thing, the way a person wants to unfold a note that looks like it might be interesting. But copper, like some friendships, is better when approached in increments. Cutting the cylinder opens not a narrative, but an attitude, a list that believes lists can save you. The strips bend reluctantly, the letters lift, the names step out one by one. Names that are not names, really more like directions with personalities. By the cistern at the valley's fork. Under the steps at the salt water, at the place of the dry washing. If a GPS spoke like this, we would think it poetic. And we would still miss our turn. The first puzzlement arrives early. The descriptions are precise in the way an old shoe is precise. You can feel how it fits someone, not you. The scroll loves landmarks that are excellent at retiring. At the third terrace by the tree. Terraces collapse. Trees volunteer for other duties. Wadis change their minds with every clever storm. What survives is the tone, not the map. It is a gentle refusal to draw. It says here, but with a voice that admits the desert has moved the furniture. This is a map that trusts shared memory and is therefore accidentally private. It is specificity without coordinates, the cartography of a conversation. It is the opposite of a travel brochure. It wants you to be from here already. The effect on archaeologists is exactly what you think. Careful excitement, the sort that borrows more notebooks. They sketch, compare, measure, and then admire the scroll's ability to be both clear and unhelpful. The treasure may be immense. The directions are a shrug that can be read for decades. Questions multiply. The way shade multiplies under a small tree at 4 in the afternoon. Who hid this? Was it priests who counted temple metals the way bakers count loaves? Was it a committee, the best and sleepest kind, naming terraces and nodding at each mention of a cistern? Or was it a tidy ring of communities, each stashing their portion like neighbors storing ladders under porches? The theories are gentle rivalries that go home by dinner time. Each makes sense on odd-numbered days. The language is practical enough to belong to accountants. The material is dramatic enough to belong to caretakers who had seen enough fires to favor metal. Some proposals are very tidy. The treasure was collected, inventoried, and redistributed on a schedule that respected the moon. Others are tidy in a different way. There was never any treasure, only the comfort that comes from imagining a future errand. That last is not as bleak as it sounds. A list can be a shelter. Sometimes writing it down is the saving. Teams go out with rods, picks, measuring tapes, and patience that has learned to be polite. A wadi looks sleepy until you try to decide where its edges used to be. The desert likes to file paperwork under sand. People dig tusk squares that resemble chess moves written by weather. Things happen. A pothinger's tale, a whistle of rumor, a stretch of ground that absolutely promises to be interesting in the next hour or so. The next hour or so remains stubbornly ordinary. Pits say nothing. You find, instead of gold, a small shard of a water jar that once wanted to be ignored. You find a rusted nail whose shapeliness insists it once wore a plank. You find a pebble with one suspiciously flat side, clearly a doorstop in its youth. Meanwhile, the scroll's verbs continue to be certain. Deposit, hide, place. The verbs do not apologize for the absence of nouns. Treasure, if it exists, prefers company at the center of the earth. One strip hints that there is. Somewhere else, another document, the missing part that names places with the confidence of a census. This suggestion is catnip for tidy minds. If there is one list, many keys, then every dry hillside becomes a drawer in a familiar desk. People search for the companion as if it were a reliable friend who always arrives late with the map to the picnic. It does not arrive, and yet the feeling remains that the scroll is part of a network, caches and notes that formed a choreography. Like keys kept in odd cups near odd doors, the system made sense to the people who lived in it. You can almost hear them practicing, steps counted from the corner, pebbles laid in a line, a palm on stone, a gesture toward salt water. If this was a decoy, it was a kind one. It taught some of us how to read terrain as prose. It taught others to let quiet places remain quiet. You can hunt with affection and still leave the ground unbothered. Back in the workrooms, science leans over the strips and reads them the way a geographer reads a coastline. Alloy tests confirm what I suspect. This is not modern sheet copper. It is old metal that grew up near old fires. Radiography makes the letters glow like bones learning to tell the time. Raking light shows the pressure of each stroke, the wobble where the scribe breathed, the place where he corrected an extra flick. These are the parts of a text that do not make headlines but make sleep agreeable. The letters align with antique habits of spelling. The numerals agree with standards that once insisted on fairness. When you measure a talent in the ancient world, you set the scale and the schedule. The amounts are large enough to tempt, small enough to believe. Reading this, you sense the calm of someone placing coins on a beam and waiting for it to find its level. Experts produce the kind of conclusions that are not charismatic, but are faithful. Authentic copper. Authentic script. Authentic desire to store value in places the desert could remember better than people. They add footnotes about toponyms, the names of places that live in mouths longer than they live on maps. They describe how a wad of clay can remember a seal, how a sealed jar can remember the smell of oil, how a deposit can remember a staircase that is now a lover's quarrel between dirt and air. The scroll resists turning itself into a story with a plot. It remains what it always promised to be, a list that refuses to introduce a main character. Many ancient texts expect applause at the end. This one expects arithmetic. Scholars sometimes laugh in the careful way scholars laugh. You can hear the affection. Somebody will research the word for fork in all the dialects. Someone else will count how often stairs appear in texts that are not about houses. These tasks are a lullaby for people who like definitions. There is eventually the bedtime hypothesis, the one good rooms invite. Suppose the caches existed and did their job. Suppose people followed the instructions in the kind of night when you can see your own certainty in the stars. Suppose they recovered what they needed to keep a festival honest, to repair a wall, to pay a debt that should not go to seed. And because people are people, suppose they did not write afterwards to tell the future that everything went well. Success rarely leaves graffiti. Or suppose the caches were never meant to be visited, not by anyone impatient and not soon. The act of inventory was the treasure, the comfort of telling metal where it belonged, of giving way to schedule, of deciding that a community could exist in a season when markets were tired. These are ordinary guesses, and they're restful. Either way, what remains is order written quietly in a stubborn medium. A list enduring not to tempt, but to reassure. Asterisk, asterisk, you can end the day by thinking about tools. The chisel that made dots like soft thunder. The copper which, if you tap it, answers in a tone that sounds like time arguing with a cup. The stylus that leaned a little when the scribe was tired of the letter yod, as everyone is eventually tired of some letter. The lamp that made the whole thing possible and then asked for nothing but oil. The rock ledge that held the scroll the way a hand holds a secret without squeezing. If you enjoy microfacts, consider this sleepy one. A copper sheet, once finished, likes to warp very slightly with temperature changes. Somewhere in that cave on some afternoon long enough ago to be comfortable, the scroll quietly reshaped itself by the breadth of a fingernail. That motion accomplished nothing and preserved everything. The desert outside still practices minimalism. Wadis draw lines and erase them. Salt dries and pretends to be small crystals that never had ambitions. Caves wait with the patience of libraries that know most of their readers are not born yet. Once in a while, a breeze rounds a corner and reads the entrance like a mouth sounding a vowel. In town, a lab light is left on, and 2 magnifying glasses rest like moons. Someone has penciled a margin note about a number that might actually be another number with dust in the wrong place. The door is locked, not dramatically, just properly. The copper strips sleep in their cases, each one a sentence that feels like a step. Another day will come with another small theory, another measured trench that decides to be honest and uninteresting, and then possibly a pebble that remembers a jar. If you've drifted off by now, the list won't mind. It has waited longer for quieter readers. The last line is not a flourish. It is simply another place that once existed, near another staircase that once preferred shade, where a person once pressed a stylus into metal and said, without saying, the rest is for you to find or to leave. The lamp goes out, the copper keeps its steady color, and the desert learns the night again.